We want to bring in Gene Ross, Senior Fellow for the Center for American Progress, and Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is President for the American Action Forum and former Congressional Budget Office Director. Let's just start out with this. Gene, is this a serious budget, or is this just politics at this point, asking for whatever you want because the House isn't going to give it to them?
It's a serious budget. It's a budget that fits together. As Mr. Frank was just saying, there's a suite of tax proposals that are integrated, that work together, that you need all of the pieces there. I think it's absolutely a serious budget that builds off the tremendous legislation we've seen enacted over the past 2 years, but also sets forth a value statement for the next 2 years.
Doug, what do you think?
It's a messaging document. It's not a governance document. There's no seriousness about it because despite all of these increases, $4.7 trillion in taxes, it takes the debt from 24 to 43 trillion over the 10 years. It adds 19 trillion in debt, which tells you just how much new spending there is, record levels, higher than we've ever seen in this nation's history, without fixing any of the existing problems. We know the existing problem is that in mandatory spending, entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, grow much faster than revenue as far as the eye can see. There's not one proposal to control that growth. So it's not a serious document, it's messaging.
Okay, Gene, I think when you look through it, some of the ideas are ones that the Democrats have wanted for a long time. They weren't able to pass it even when they had control of the House as well. So I guess I just wonder what happens next, particularly in an interest rate hiking environment that the Fed's been on, when all of that additional interest is going to add up and mean we have to pay much more than we ever had to pay to borrow before. Does it change the equation? Does it make it more difficult? Where do we go in terms of these negotiations between the administration and the House?
I think it is a plan that could be enacted. It's now up to Congress to take into account the budget. I point to the two proposals on the Medicare tax rate. That's very much designed to address one of the challenges before the budget, extending the solvency lifetime for this Medicare trust fund. So in that respect, it's a very serious budget.
Gene, one of the premises of this whole budget, as the president laid out yesterday, is that he said that billionaires only pay a tax rate of 3%, and they pay less than a firefighter or police fighter. In fact, the White House says it's 8%, and even that 8% for billionaires is based on their unrealized capital gains over the course of 2021, which was a huge year in the stock market. What do you think, other than the revenue issue, do you think this really does anything for inequality? And what do you think a more rational tax or rational rate would look like, given that the top 1% now pay a record 42% of all taxes?
I think most Americans agree that the tax rate on wealth should not be preferred over the taxes that we pay on our earnings from salaries, our earnings from work. If you look at the budget, another proposal which you didn't mention in your introduction is the president's proposal to reinstate a full refundable child tax credit, which we saw last year when the poverty statistics for 2021 came out, resulted in a historic reduction in child poverty. So I think it certainly does look at how do we address the tremendous inequality of particularly wealth and earnings in our society.
Hey, Doug, I would also say, though, some of that federal expenditures have certainly fueled the fires of inflation, which is part of the big problem that we're dealing with right now. The bills have to be paid for at some point.
Yeah, there's no question the inflation affects federal finances, but it does it on both sides of the equation. It raises revenue as well as raising spending. So, you know, hopefully, the Fed will be successful, and we'll get back to the 2% target in an expeditious fashion. It's probably going to take a year or two. But, you know, this budget, you know, you and I both know that tax proposals wouldn't go through a democratically controlled Congress, so they're not going to go through this one. There's nothing in there on mandatory spending, so that's 70% of spending, so leave that aside. You're going to have some discussions between the administration and Congress on the annual discretionary spending, and that's all this is about. The rest is just show.
Okay, so let me ask both of you very seriously, setting this aside, One of the huge issues we've been talking about this morning is trying to make sure that the government doesn't default, that we are able to raise the budget, or raise the deficit, and that goes through. There is going to be a negotiation between Congress and the White House on that. Can you each lay out how you realistically think that might kind of be scripted out, a realistic plan that keeps us from defaulting and creating more unnecessary pressure in a situation where there's already so much concern swirling in the financial situation? Jean, politics aside, just honestly, where do you think we wind up, let's say, by June of this year?
I think we should all agree that the debt ceiling must be increased. It shouldn't be taken hostage, that the nation should...
Again, let's not use talking points here. Let's just get to what we think actually happens, because both these sides are going to negotiate. We can all say what we think about these things, but where do we realistically wind up?
I think we have to increase the debt ceiling. Full stop, no questions asked. To not do so would be a calamity for the economy.
Doug, how do you think we get there?
It looks a lot like 2011 to me, Becky. There's not going to be an early resolution. Both sides are very dug in. The politics are unattractive. And so what we saw in 2011 was we came close. We saw a lot of fallout in financial markets, a lot of volatility, spreads increasing. We got a downgrade out of that episode. And I don't see anything in the tea leaves right now that looks different than that. It gets done, but it has some harm in it.
All right, Doug, Jean, want to thank you. And